Good evening. It's good to see everyone tonight and appreciate the presence of not only our own members, but we have visitors with us. It's always good to have you in our number. And as we study from God's Word, there may be some things that are new to you, some things you've never heard before, some things you'd like some more information on, and we'd love nothing more to be able to sit down with someone and be able to study the Word of God with you. Tonight, the lesson does come from this idea that's found there in Zechariah chapter 4 about despising the day of small things. And this phrase caught my eye as I was having a discussion with someone who is studying with someone else. And what they're struggling with is the idea of where do I start, or having a hard time starting. That they've messed a lot of things up in their life and a lot of things have gone wrong. And because of that, it seems like life is in turmoil and it can get very overwhelming when things have been destroyed and lost. And you just kind of want to hold on to where you're at because you know that nothing can be as glorious as it was before. That is sort of the situation that you have here in Zechariah chapter 4, is that Zerubbabel is going to lead the captives that have been in captivity for some 70 years now back to Jerusalem, and he's going to rebuild the temple. They've been gone for 70 years, which means if you think about someone who may have been 10 years old when they went into captivity, now being 80 years old and coming back. And there are people who could actually remember what the temple looked like in the days of Solomon and all of its glory. But because of the sins that they had committed, because of the punishment that God had inflicted, now the land lies in ruins. The stones are laid upon one another in a disorderly fashion, that there would be mold and moss and trash just scattered everywhere where this glorious temple used to be. But Zerubbabel is going to begin a work of God. And when he begins this work, he's going to meet with some opposition. And there's going to be some things that people are going to remember that could be a hindrance and could be something that really kills zeal and fervor. But he reminds them, don't despise the day of small things. And so we're going to talk about the importance of, and if you're ready for your 3 words, let's see your notebooks held up high, because these are the things that we're going to talk about. Very good. We're going to talk about trust. Then the day of small things, trust that he who began a good work in you will complete it till the day of the Lord. This is one of the things that Paul tells us even in the New Testament. That's something that God has begun and something that God has given the task for. He will see it through to completion. We need to trust in him and not in our own resources and our own idea of how glorious things may or may not be. That though something may seem very, very small, that this is a little thing, that this is something that is insignificant, we shouldn't look at it as being unimportant. God often works through things that are small, things that are little. And so taking those little baby steps, taking those initial steps toward the thing that God would have you to do are very important. It is really the day-to-day task that we're most tempted in. And as we're going to see, for many, if it was one big task, one big accomplishment, that's what a lot of us think of as being the hallmarks or the definition of a successful life, is having something big and glorious to look back upon, that one event that can be put on our headstone. And that's not what a life well lived really looks like. A life that's lived for God is about really doing the things that God would have you do each and every day, no matter how small or little they may appear in our own eyes. So there's a few things that I want us to look at as we take this passage out of its context a little bit, but I first want to put it in its context. And so there's a few different places that you can look to see some things that are very, very closely tied together. Ezra chapter 3, the book of Haggai, and Zechariah. You probably found Zechariah by now. It's the next to last book of the Old Testament. The one that's right before that, in my Bible is just one page, is Haggai. And then Ezra, you can look in the index and find that one. All right, so when we go through these passages, we're going to see something that's very closely tied together because they are very close in regards to the same events during the same time period. So as I said, Zerubbabel is going to be the one who is tasked, and this is the year about 538 BC, that Zerubbabel is given the task of going back to Jerusalem and rebuilding the temple. King Cyrus of Persia has signed the decree, and now they're able to go back. When he goes back, he only has with him about 50,000 people. So let's go to Ezra chapter 3 and just get a little bit of the idea of what's going on. Ezra chapter 3. In Ezra chapter 3, this is where we see that the initial stages of the temple are going to be built. The foundation's going to be laid. Ezra chapter 3, we're going to start at verse 3. He talks about in the first few verses about it being laid. It's in its initial stages. Then in verse 3, though fear had come upon them because of the people of those countries. They set the altar on its basis, and they offered burnt offerings on it to the Lord, both the morning and the evening burnt offerings. They also kept the Feast of Tabernacle, as it was written, and offered the daily burnt offerings in the number required by the ordinance of the day. And then it talks about some of the other things that they did with their feasts and their sacrifices. What I wanted to point out from this is that the temple has not yet been built. It's just now getting started. But really the first thing that happens is worship starts again. And you can imagine how it is that they have now been able to return, but they're in this land that's not just them anymore, but you have foreign individuals and foreign nations that have occupied this land, and they're not happy about seeing the Israelites return. But the first thing that they do, in spite of the opposition, is they begin to worship again. And you can imagine what it was like to have that faith being realized. They've been in a foreign country for 70 years. They haven't had their place of worship in that span of time for generations now. That you can imagine the fear that was there in offering to God the thing that He sent them into captivity because they were not offering to Him. And now they're able to do this thing where they're supposed to do it. And you can imagine the kind of hope that they would have had. But not all is well, because it does bring back lots of memories. If you skip down to verses 10 and 11 of that same chapter, Ezra chapter 3, verses 10 and 11, says, "When the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, the priests stood in their apparel with trumpets, and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with the cymbals to praise the Lord, according to the ordinance of David, king of Israel. And they sang responsively, praising and giving thanks to the Lord, for He is good, for His mercy endures forever toward Israel. Then all the people shouted with a great shout when they praised the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. But," verse 12, "but many of the priests and the Levites and heads of the fathers' houses, old men who had seen the first temple, wept with a loud voice when the foundation of this temple was laid before their eyes. Yet many shouted aloud for joy, so that the people could not discern the noise of the shout of the joy from the noise of the weeping of the people. For the people shouted with a loud shout, and the sound was heard afar off." He says that even though people were shouting and playing trumpets and making this loud noise of exalting the name of God, there were others who were weeping just as loudly because they remembered the first temple. And this is not as good. It is not as big. It is not as ornate. You can see that very clearly when we turn over to Haggai chapter 2. Haggai 2. And if you remember, the context of Haggai is that the people were building the temple, and yet they stalled after a time. They were met with opposition from outsiders. There were also certain government edicts that were signed against them. And during that time, the people lost interest, it seems, in building the temple. And in chapter 1, they went about building their own paneled houses while the temple of the Lord still lay in ruins. In chapter 2 and verse 3, Haggai has been sent that he might stir the people up once again. And he says, "Who is left among you who saw this temple in its former glory? And how do you see it now? In comparison with it, is this not in your eyes as nothing?" And yet he tells Zerubbabel in verse 4 to be strong, because, as he says at the end of that verse, "For I am with you, says the Lord of hosts." God says that I am going to be with you, Zerubbabel. Don't allow this frustration and these things that may cause you to think that you can't complete this task to dissuade you from doing God's work. I am with you. So in the eyes of the people, many of the people, it's something that is nothing, is as nothing compared to what they used to have. Everything is in shambles. It will never be as good as it used to be. But in God's eyes, He says, you do it because I am with you. You're accomplishing my task. And so now we go back to Zechariah one more time, chapter 4. I appreciate Brad backing up in the context of Zechariah chapter 4, because Zerubbabel is indeed given this task. And back in verse 6, it says, "This is the word of the Lord to Zerubbabel. It's not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord. Who are you, O great mountain? Before Zerubbabel you shall become a plain, and he shall bring forth the capstone with the shouts of grace, grace to it. Moreover, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, the hands of Zerubbabel, having laid the foundation of this temple, his hand shall also finish it. Then you shall know that the Lord of hosts has sent me to you." And then in verse 10, you have a verse that for many of us is a little confusing when he says, "Who has despised the day of small things. And then he talks about these 10 eyes of the Lord. That's prophetic language to talk about the ability that God has to see everything and how it is that he looks and observes everything that is happening. The lampstand is symbolic of his presence and his approval that is there. That's why in Revelation it talks about him removing the candlestick from the lampstands and things such as that. But here it talks about God's presence. In the eyes of the people, many of them, this was a small, insignificant thing that would never be as good as it used to be. In the eyes of God, this was something that was going to give him glory. He sees it, he approves of it, and he is happy to see the plumb line, the thing that measured for straightness in the rebuilding of the temple, in Zerubbabel's hands. This is the point. Had their obligation to God changed at all? First temple, now the second temple, not as good as it used to be. Two things were true. God's word had not changed, and their obligation to do it had not changed. The condition or situation of the temple did not really matter when it came to that. They're rebuilding something that was destroyed. And yes, it's not going to be as good as the first time. Sin has consequences. The way in which we choose to live our lives have consequences. And the point for us that I'm trying to make tonight is this, is that you may have made a mess of a lot of things. A lot of mistakes, a lot of sins. A lot of things lie in the wake. That maybe at one time you had a very, very promising start and things in your life were going really, really well. Your relationship with God was strong. But now you don't feel that way anymore. And you start to think that nothing that you do really matters anymore because of how much you messed up. That you're too far gone to come back. The former days of glory will never return. And what Satan would have us think is the case from that is we're never going to be able to do anything, and that God doesn't care anymore, and that we are now worthless, that we are small, we are little, and we are insignificant. And that is one of the temptations that Satan throws at us, is that we're tempted to feel like we are small and insignificant people. You remember 1 Corinthians chapter 12, and you want to go ahead and turn over there. 1 Corinthians chapter 12. And in that chapter, you remember how it's talking about and leading into the idea of spiritual gifts. And how it is in chapter 12 when he starts this discussion about spiritual gifts. Some people don't have the same spiritual gifts that others. There's even the case that some don't have any spiritual gifts whatsoever. And in a congregation, you might feel like you're insignificant, that you're small because you can't contribute as someone else does, or you don't have the same kind of talent or ability that other people do. And so he used the figures of hands and feet and eyes and smelling and these types of things to illustrate the body's not made up of one part. It's made up of many. And it's because of the many parts that are joined together that the body is able to do what it's supposed to do, function correctly. And I love verse 18. Verse 18 of that text says, God has set each member in the body just as he sees fit. That God, the all-seeing eyes of God, sees the talents and abilities that you have. And the talents and the abilities that you have, whether you feel like they're small or little or insignificant, or that in the past you've made too many mistakes to now contribute to the work of God, all of that is nonsense. That is not the all-seeing eye of God and what he sees. What he sees is the talent and the ability that you provide, that you are a vital part of the body of Jesus Christ. Don't let Satan ever make you think that you're not important, that you're meaningless, that you're insignificant, that your life will never be the same former glory that it used to be. That is not true. That's not the way that God measures you. And that's not the way we should measure ourselves. And so you have in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 that sometimes the way that God does this is by allowing us to have difficulties, allowing us to have hardships and things that may keep us from being in that fulfilled state that we think we should be. 2 Corinthians chapter 12 is when Paul is talking about this thorn in the flesh that was given to him. And this thorn in the flesh that was given to him was meant to humble him, to keep him from becoming too arrogant and thinking too much of himself. And he even prayed to God, God, please let this thing be removed from me. There's many things that we've probably prayed for. God, let this memory of that past marriage be removed from me. God, let this memory of how hateful and mean and angry I was be removed from me. God, let it be that all this debt and irresponsibility that was in my life, let these things be removed from me. Many times those things are there, and what they should do is humble us to know that God's grace is sufficient. You can still be saved. Even Paul glorified God because of this thing. Throughout the scriptures, you see people who were pressed down, and that the world and Satan was trying to make them feel small and insignificant. Think about Daniel and this Hebrew young man, Daniel, and that he's a very young man, teenager most likely, as he goes into captivity. And this young man is then made a eunuch and is forced to serve as a eunuch for the leader of that land. It's not by choice that he does that, but he's made to do that. That they want to fill him with the delicacies that he as a Hebrew does not want to and is not supposed to be partaking in. And he finds a way to make it work. And then even as he rises in prominence among the people, there are others who become jealous, and they say, we need to get rid of Daniel. He's taking too much honor and prestige. So let's make sure there's a way of tripping him up. But the only way to do it, as you remember, is because he prays to God. So let's make a decree. Anybody praying to some other god is to be thrown into a den of lions. And this small, insignificant, nothing Hebrew goes to his room, opens his window, and he prays that day just like he's done every other day. A small, insignificant thing, and yet he's tempted to feel small, and that's the way that God often works, and the manner in which he works through people. You think about his Hebrew companions, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. A wave of people are gathered around because this idol is about to be worshiped. And when the trumpets sound and it's time to worship this idol, you can see these people that will fall down and begin to bow down to this idol, except for these three. So those three are brought up to the king, remember? And he tells them, I'm going to give you one more chance. But if you don't do it, I'm going to throw you into this fiery furnace. Why should we answer you? Is basically the answer. God can save us if he chooses to, but even if he doesn't, we don't have to answer you. We are not going to bow down to your idol. They're thrown into the fiery furnace, and they begin walking around in there. And even the ones who throw them in are consumed by that great fire. You think about someone like David and how small and insignificant he was made to be. The prophet goes to the house of his father. And because there's somebody in that house that God's going to choose to be anointed as the next king. And so when he brings his sons in, he brings in all these other brothers of David, but he doesn't bring in David. David's still out in the field. And as these sons come before Samuel, there's one especially that he looks at and says, this man is tall, he is rugged, that looks like a king. And God says, I don't look at people the same way you do. That's not him. So he goes through all the brothers, and God hasn't chosen any of them. He says, is there anybody left? He's like, there's David. And that's the one God chose. Remember when he goes into battle against Goliath? That they say, you just came out here. His own brothers ridicule him. You just came out here to see a big fight. Where are those few sheep that you've left at home? And made to feel like he's nothing and insignificant. Saul says, you need armor, so let me put my armor on you. And it's too big, it's cumbersome, it doesn't fit. He can't use it. But when he goes out there and fights Goliath, even Goliath looks at him and says, am I a dog that somebody has sent out here with a stick to run me off? But we remember how that turned out. Over and over again, we see people who are tempted to feel small and insignificant. And yet these are the ones that God chooses over and over and over again to do those tasks that he would have them to do. Because, as I said, God often works through very small things. Remember 2 Kings chapter 5. You may want to go ahead and turn over there. 2 Kings chapter 5. That you have this man named Naaman who is a soldier of great prominence. But the problem that he has is that he is also a leper. But there's this Hebrew slave girl. She finds out about his leprosy. She feels compassion about it and wants something good to happen for Naaman. And so she says, there's this prophet that could heal that leprosy. Was that something great that she did or something small and insignificant that she did? It was a small task. All she had was a conversation with someone about this prophet that could heal this leprosy. So Naaman goes to the house of the prophet, and you remember the prophet doesn't even come out. He sends his servant out there and says, yeah, go dip in the Jordan 7 times, you'll be healed. Remember how Naaman reacted? He became furious, angry, went away in a rage. But notice in 2 Kings chapter 5, verse 11, Naaman became furious. And he went away and said, indeed, I said to myself, he will surely come out to me, stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, and wave his hand over the place and heal the leprosy. Are not the Abna and the Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and went away in a rage. If it was something great, something magnificent, to accomplish this thing, something spectacular had to happen. At least it had to be clean water. But then his servant, in verse 13, came near and spoke to him and said, my father, if the prophet had told you to do something great, would you not have done it? How much more then when he says to you, wash and be clean? The small thing was the thing that was going to make the difference. And we use that story of Naaman to illustrate a very profound point. God is not asking something profound of us most times. It is something that is easy to accomplish, readily accessible, and makes the grace of God really feel like a gift that we do not deserve. The man had leprosy. Dipping in the river 7 times to cure the leprosy? I mean, how wonderful would that be? Colossians 2 and verse 12 says that we trust in the working of God whenever it is that we are baptized. It is not a matter of that we feel like we're deserving of something. It is truly trusting that God is going to save me by simply doing the small thing that he has asked. But how many times people try to make it into something big? I have to say this big, long, long prayer, and I have to fall on my face and do all these other things, and that's not what God has asked for. God has said, here's my grace, receive it. Have faith in my working. That when we're baptized, we do that because we believe in what God is able to do. It's a small thing that God asks of us. Think about John 4 when Jesus is there with the Samaritan woman. And in John 4, Jesus goes in this area of Samaria. He sits by a well, and he has a conversation with a woman. And then you remember what happens at the end of this? A whole city is converted. That started with a small conversation between strangers. A conversation with a slave girl. A man is healed from his leprosy. A conversation with this Samaritan woman. A whole city is converted. Our theme this year is about loving to tell the story. And brethren, it is something just as simple and easy as telling the story. To get out of God's way and let him work. The story of Jesus is enough to convert and to convict and to hold us firm because it speaks to who God is and his greatest desire for mankind. In Matthew 13, 31 through 33, you take a small seed, a mustard seed, and you take that very small seed and you plant it in the ground. And Jesus says, observe what happens. It grows into a tree where the birds come and nest in its branches. But it starts from just a small thing, and that's what the kingdom is. Don't think that you have to do something that's huge, something that's big and monumental. You don't have to preach before thousands of people. You don't have to have some spiritual gift. You don't have to have some kind of special talent or ability. All you need is a small seed. What can you say in a conversation with someone else that's going to make a difference? That's how God works. James 5:16, how many people have been helped because the effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much? Remember that Jesus in that Matthew 13 passage didn't just talk about the mustard seed, but he also talked about leaven. And most of the time when you read about leaven, it's used in a negative connotation. In that passage, he uses it in a positive one. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. It's a little leaven that a woman puts into this dough, and it spreads and permeates and causes the dough to rise. Your prayers may not seem like very much, but a little bit of leaven leavens the whole lump. Do you truly believe that your prayers avail much? Or is it an afterthought or an obligation that you have to go through? Don't despise the day of small things. This is how God operates most of the time, so that our trust might be in him and not in ourselves. And so in Hebrews 13 and verse 2, you have another example when we talk about hospitality. Does hospitality really matter? Does opening our homes and opening our livelihoods to share something with someone else, does it matter? Hebrews 13 and verse 2 says that some people unknowingly entertained angels from hospitality. Big things are accomplished through small things when they're put into the hands of God. And so the encouragement I want to give to you as my brethren is this. Sometimes we go through the scriptures and we measure ourselves inappropriately. You look at Proverbs 31, and I know for a fact that my sisters, you hear this sermon all the time about Proverbs 31. You study it all the time. And it is something we should study. It's something that we should try to emulate. It's something we should encourage one another to. But because the Proverbs 31 woman is so excellent in the things that she does, she stays up all night. She rises early in the morning. She's going all over the place buying and selling land. Her husband's sitting at the gate being praised for it, right? And when you go through there, you think that I can't do that. And you forget that getting up in the morning and fixing your children breakfast is an important thing, a meaningful thing. That going into their room at night to comfort them when they are crying, to teach them how to say prayers and reading stories to them. Blessing their life through the small, everyday things that you do is the way in which God Himself is operating in your life. Don't despise the day of small things. That we know that the work that we do, we're doing it as unto the Lord. In this morning's class, we talked about even the slaves, that the slaves were to be mindful that the work that they're doing is something that they're actually serving God in. They should be honorable and have honor for their masters, even if they're unbelievers. We know from Colossians it says that the work that you do it as unto the Lord. And so it reminds you that, yes, I'm working for this boss, and he may not appreciate me, I may not be rewarded, but that's not who I'm working for. I'm working for the Lord. And so that wife that's at home and she's vacuuming and the dust and the dirt, toys, kids, as you're doing that work, you're doing that because you're a good, godly woman. And God sees that. Where do you need to start, though? Do you feel like you've been beat down, that you don't feel like anything you do is going to matter? Don't despise the day of small beginnings. Tomorrow morning, getting up and saying your prayer before you start the day. Don't despise the day of small things. Sending your kids down and having a 5-minute discussion with them about how God has blessed you and your family. Don't despise the day of small things. Being able to love your husband and to love your children. And it's interesting that in Titus, when it talks about the younger women needing to be taught how to love, it's really the idea of just liking them. Because we know you love each other, but sometimes it's hard to like each other. Don't despise the day of small things, because they are so very, very important. John chapter 13, remember that Jesus, even as he's about to go to the cross and he's had that Last Supper with his disciples, they begin to argue about which one is the greatest. And Jesus takes the bowl and the towel, and he goes about washing the feet of his disciples. The time where he needs to be comforted, he's having to teach another lesson to his disciples about service to one another. And toward the end of John 13, he tells them that this is the way other people are going to know that you're my disciples, by the love that you have for one another. How can we show that in little ways that make a big difference? What Jesus did was a great thing, a thing that most of us probably would not want to do, to be of that level of service. But let me tell you some of the things you can do. Things I've seen some of you, many of you, do. Sending a card to someone. A text message to someone. I'm thinking about you. I know you're going through a hard time. I'm praying for you. Having your children learn how to make cards for people. I know when we were in Alabama, we had a lot of people in the congregation that were going through a lot of illnesses. So we spent a lot of time in hospitals. And we did with the kids what many of you do. They would make little drawings and they couldn't even write their name, and it's just crayon being scribbled on a piece of cardstock. And we might have them a store-bought card with a beautiful image, terrific poetry, and some very sentimental thoughts. When you went to visit them at home or in the hospital, what do you think was hanging on the wall? It wasn't that nice, beautiful card. It was that scribble from that child. Why do you think that was? Don't despise the day of small things. We're Christians. We sing songs like, "Sing and be happy." And with everything that's going on in the world, should it not be us who are always happy and joyful? Amen. So can we smile? Is that something we can do? Can you smile and have a conversation with another person about what a great day that God has given to us? A small conversation. Don't despise the day of small things. Just spending time with brethren and letting them know that you're there for them. By the love that you have for one another, people will know that you're my disciples. In Matthew 25, Jesus reminds them that if they give to someone who is sick, to someone who is without clothing, to someone who is hungry, to someone who is thirsty, Jesus says, inasmuch as you've done it to one of the least of these, my brethren, Jesus says, you've done it to me. And you remember that they're surprised. When did we see you this way? Don't despise the day of small things. Matthew 10, verse 42, Jesus makes the statement that if you give even a cup of cool water to someone in the name of a disciple, you'll receive a disciple's reward. Small things, but don't despise that day of small things. Let's close tonight with Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 10. Hebrews 6 does have a lot of encouragement, and it has some things in it that are pretty tough teaching as well. But there's some encouragement here in Hebrews chapter 6 also, and especially around verse 10. And this is the comfort that ought to give to us, to go about doing whatever it is that we know we can do, no matter how small or little it may be. Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 10. For God is not unjust to forget your work and labor of love, which you have shown toward his name, and that you have ministered to the saints and do minister. God is not unjust. He's not going to forget. The all-seeing, the 10 eyes of God that we read about with Zerubbabel. He does see. And so, yeah, it may be that you've had a lot of things in your past. You've had a lot of mistakes. There's a lot of things that need fixed. And you look back at it and say, you know what, it'll never be as good as it used to be. And you may be right about that. But that's not how you're measured. And that's not what God sees. What God sees is your labor of love and the way that you minister to the brethren. So never be discouraged. And by all means, never despise the day of small things, because they do make a huge difference. And so that's the question I'm going to leave with you tonight, is this one, is do you trust God's ability to work in those small things? It's day to day. It's not the monumental deals. It's the small, everyday task. If you're not a Christian tonight, you can be. If you need to start your walk with God, or if there's things that you've been neglecting that you need to get back to work on, and you need some help on where to start with those things, let us help you. That's what we're here to do, that God may be glorified through it. Please come as together we stand and sing if you're subject.